I'd like to introduce Daniel North here with us today with Thompson Coburn. He's a real estate attorney, works on a variety of different things within mainly the commercial real estate space, and we're definitely thankful to have him here with us today. And if you have any questions at all during this webinar as we move through it, definitely feel free to interrupt when it's appropriate, obviously. Otherwise, you can always put your questions in the chat, and then I'll make sure that they get asked. Or, of course, you can hold them to the latter part of the webinar, whatever floats your boat. But otherwise, I'll go ahead and give the floor to you, Daniel, and we can go ahead and get started.
Great. Yeah, again, sorry for the delay in hopping on. I, just like everyone, I'm navigating all the different platforms during COVID. So
Absolutely.
Sorry for the delay in getting this checklist out to you all. Were you able to circulate that to the folks who are on?
I did. I can actually share it right now as well. So let me go ahead and do that.
That'd be great. Okay, I've got my PDF up, so I'm going to run through that. So if you just want to kind of scroll along with me.
Will do.
So this isn't, the funnest thing for us to go through. Not the most glamorous part of the job, but it's, an important piece of what I do, and thought it might be something that would be valuable for you all as students. So is everyone who's on a current law school student?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, everyone's a law student.
So, one of the things that I really wish I had during law school, and it's hard to find, is just some practical knowledge and practical training on the day-to-day of being a real estate attorney. And so this is one of those things that I thought might be helpful for you all to see, and some of the subparts that I'll talk about as I walk through it are hopefully beneficial. And if you all end up pursuing a job in a real estate, transactional real estate role, checklists are a big part of that. And some of these pieces that I'm gonna touch on are big pieces of the practical everyday stuff that you do for your clients. So this, I went through and sort of scrubbed out all of the party and property and price information from this. Hopefully I got everything. I think I did. But this is otherwise an example of what a checklist would look like. The context here is I'm representing the purchaser of the property. And this is a checklist that sort of lays out all of the closing, all the pieces of closing, the various documents, the various boxes that need to be checked. It starts out before getting into the checklist, though, with a timeline, which is something, again, getting back to just the practical side of the job. The way this sort of goes is, a client might reach out to me, and this is how it happened in this instance. The client reached out to me and said, we've got a property we're looking at. Can you draft a purchase and sale agreement for us? And once that, we go through a process of negotiating a purchase and sale agreement with the other side, with the seller's attorneys. And once that's all worked out and the purchase and sale agreement has been signed, then the task for me is to create this document for my clients, rather than, every time they want to know, okay, when's my due diligence period up? Or when do I need to put up my next chunk of earnest money? Rather than, going and digging through the 60-page purchase agreement, they can go to this, hopefully faster answer for them in the form of the checklist and the timeline. And another thing we do with this is I go through after I've created this, and I put this, put all these key dates into my calendar with, a bunch of reminders, and also into the calendar of any other attorneys who are working on the project with me.
Hey, Daniel, could you tell us a little bit more, for those who might not be as familiar yet, what like the due diligence period is and what kind of the main stages of a deal are?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question. So you usually have a few stages. I like the way you describe that, stages of a purchase, of a purchase of a piece of commercial property. And so in this instance, this is a piece of manufacturing property that's being purchased, and it's going to be developed into a multifamily, so an apartment building. And so the first stage that you'll come to, you'll usually have pretty early on after an agreement is signed, be putting up a big chunk of earnest money. So say it's a $50 million acquisition, you might be putting up, $1 million of earnest money or $500,000 of earnest money within 2 or 3 days of signing the contract. So that's sort of your first big key deadline that you're always going to see. After that, you've got a few days for the seller to deliver title and survey if they have it. If they're not going to be, if they already have it and they're going to be providing that to you. Then you've got your next big key date, and I'm going to get to answering your question, Jack, I promise. But the next big key date is going to be your title review period. So you might have 30 days, 45 days, 60 days to review title. As an aside, if any of this is just totally, foreign language to any of you, don't feel like you're behind it all, because during law school, like I said, you don't get much of the practical side, unfortunately. And so I think, don't feel like you're behind the curve. If you're kind of lost with some of this, you'll pick it up as you go. But so that next big hurdle is going to be your title review period. So you'll get from the title insurance company, from the and this deal with Chicago Title, is a title insurance company that we work with a great deal, and they give me as purchaser's attorney a title commitment for title insurance on the property. And so I go through that and look for exceptions to title, and any exceptions that are problematic for my client. An example might be there's an electrical easement that runs through the middle of the property, and you can't build, in the middle of this piece of property where my client wants to, obviously construct a huge building. So that would be problematic. And so the solutions are either to work with the title company to get that off of title, or in the instances where that's not possible, and sometimes it's not, you're going to go back to your client and say, look, you can't build where you want to build. These are the alternatives for how to deal with this. What do you want to do? So after that, you're going to, I'm not going to hit on everything. We've got limited time here, but there's different dates in here where you'll see there's different triggers for more earnest money to go up. And then what Jack was asking about is due diligence. Here in this contract, it was referred to as the inspection period. Same concept. So I think here my clients had, I want to say we had 60 days initially, with some options to extend. But due diligence or inspection period is essentially a time for not only finishing title and survey, which I said can be a separate trigger, which came earlier in this instance, but it's the time for the client to go out and look at the property and do all their diligence as far as, is there an environmental contamination? Is there some easement on the property, like I talked about, that's going to stop them from being able to construct whatever development they want to build? Is there, is the project fiscally? A lot of times, developers will, and my clients are mainly developers. That's who I do the bulk of my work with. Developers oftentimes will enter into these contracts because they catch wind of an attractive piece of property, and they know that there's a potential for some development that could be profitable for them on that property, but they haven't, run the traps, as they say, on whether or not it's a feasible development, whether or not it can be profitable for them. Sometimes they haven't run those traps in full until they're already under contract and you're in this inspection or due diligence period. And so the idea is, during this period, you get some time, you have access to the seller's documents about the property, and you have access to the property to go and do an inspection and do environmental tests or whatever else you think you need to do. And also during that time, you're figuring out if the project is economically feasible for you. And if you determine that it's not, you have until the end of the inspection period, which in this case was extended out a few times, because of COVID, which has been obviously an interesting wrinkle for a lot of projects. But you have until the end of the inspection period to make that decision. And if you decide that it's not a feasible project for you or an attractive opportunity for whatever reason, and for no reason, you are able to get out of the contract, and in most instances get your earnest money that you've deposited back. So Jack, do you have any follow-up questions to that before I move on?
No, I think that answers it. Just wanted to get kind of a high level idea of what that was. So thank you.
Absolutely. And if I'm going too detailed or too 40,000 foot of anything, just let me know.
I think a combination of both is excellent for what we're trying to do.
So, the other things you're going to see in here are like deadlines for giving notice to various parties. In this instance, the property that we are acquiring is the entire facility for a business, for an operating business. So there's different notifications you need to give to different governmental entities in that context. So then there's another trigger, another expiration or key date in development projects frequently that I work on. And this one, like I said, happens to be multifamily, which means apartment building and then ground floor retail. So there might be some restaurants or some shops on the first floor. My bread and butter, what I normally work on for developer clients, is industrial projects. And so in both those instances, this next key date is a really important one. It's the zoning period. So that's a period you've already gone past your inspection period, your due diligence period. In most instances, whatever earnest money you had initially put up is going to be hard, as they say, which means essentially non-refundable. So the seller's keeping that money at this point. But you do still have an opportunity to back out of the project if one or a few other conditions are not met, and that's centered around zoning approval. And so that's essentially approval from whatever the controlling governmental entities are. In this instance, it would be the city of Chicago mainly, and Cook County in the state of Illinois. And so if you essentially are going through a process for 6 months after the inspection period, working with the city, the county, the state, the EPA, whatever governmental entities have control over your site, to say, can I build, I want to build a 20-story apartment building here. Can I build that? What are the hurdles? Does the project remain economically viable in spite of those hurdles? So that's what this period is for. Like I said, if you get deep into this one, you still have an opportunity to get out of the deal. But you're gonna, in most instances, be giving up whatever that chunk of earnest money you put in initially. That can be a pretty sizable sum. Might be $500,000, might be $1 million, depending on the size of the project. So, and then of course closing. That's the hectic day for me and for Sellers Council, where we're essentially working with Chicago Title in this instance, or whoever the title company is, to get all the various documents in. This transaction is going to have, over 100 documents from both sides going in at closing, and so it's a big, a big task. Mainly organizing and being careful that all the T's are crossed and all the I's are dotted, all the signatures are signed and the dates are right and all that stuff. So obviously a big date. This next portion here, this is just for my clients' use, and again, just to make their lives easier. If they exercise these different extension options they have under their contract, I've broken down how all the other dates change. So then, do you guys have any questions before we move into the checklist items? I know this is a little dry.
I think we're good on our end.
All right. Feel free to stop me or interrupt me at any point. So this is just a checklist of, like I said, documents and other items and things that have to be done. So this is something we use to track from, this deal. This is a large deal, and I've already been working on it for a year, and it will be another year probably before it's done. And when I say it's done in this instance, that means we, purchase the property. And then for this particular client, I'll be able to see this project through from beginning to end. So about a year ago, they called me and said, we're looking at this property. And about another year from now, we'll probably close the transaction, which means we'll officially buy the property from the seller. And then I'll be able to work on the next phase, which will be obtaining, well, actually, I skipped an important one. Leading up to closing, we'll work on financing the acquisition. So our client will find a bank that's going to lend them the bulk of the money. They'll probably find a capital partner who's going to inject a bunch of money. And then, so we'll handle all the loan documents and all the guarantee documents and things like that for those. Then we'll close, and then we will go into the next phase, which is, for this will be construction. So we'll handle drafting all the construction documents. We'll handle various aspects as construction progresses. And then we will then go into the phase of leasing. So the building will be built, and we'll assist our client with leasing up the property. And then this particular client at that point will probably look to sell the property. Sometimes they'll hold on to them, sometimes they sell them. In this instance, it will probably be a sale. So we'll do all the leasing work, and then we'll go the next step and do the sale work, the opposite of what I'm doing now on the buyer side. So it's that what I just described, that process of being able to see a project through from beginning to end, is why I chose real estate law. It's something Jack and I talked about over coffee a while back. It's really, to me, the most interesting and fun part of being a transactional real estate attorney is, seeing a property that go from a warehouse to an apartment building over the course of 3 years, and then, and then your client sells off of it or holds on to it or whatever the case may be. So.
And then Daniel, is that process going to look the same for, or at least close to the same for every client, or are there things that are going to be wildly different with that general outline of the process that you just gave us?
It can be with developers. A lot of that is going to be pretty similar. You're always going to go through this due diligence phase, the various phases we're going through right now that I described. You're obviously always going to close, and you're always going to have some sort of financing. That financing can vary by client. Some clients have their own capital sources, so they may inject $50 million into a project themselves. Some clients will look for outside capital, which might be from investors, which will be the case here. But then there's almost always a finance, pure finance component as well, which is going to a bank, going to, Wells Fargo or whoever the bank may be, and looking for, 60, 70, 80% of the transaction value and a loan. So that phase is frequently there. The thing that differs probably most frequently among different clients is whether or not they hold on to the property or sell it. So we have a number of clients who do what these guys do. They develop the property and sell it off. We have a number of folks who develop it and hold it. And then we have a number of folks, obviously, who just buy stuff other groups have already developed, and hold on to and manage those as their business. And so it can vary pretty greatly. It's a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Jack, I'm going to try to go through this pretty quickly because I know you wanted to get to sort of a phase of talking about navigating law school and finding a job after the employment.
Yeah, I mean, feel free to whatever pace you want to go to. We still
Well,
got.
This is like I said, I think this is probably pretty dry for folks. So I'll go through this checklist pretty quickly, and then we'll get to talking about things you can do when you're looking for a job.
No problem.
So you've got some obvious stuff on here: purchase and sale closing documents. You got your deed, bill of sale. That's where you're going to be transferring ownership of any personal property within the building. FERPTA, GAP, these affidavits, these things are title documents that are requirements of an owner's affidavit is the same requirements of the title company for closing. Release of seller's financing, that's, obviously a big one. It doesn't take a lot of work on my part, obviously. It's something the seller's going to handle, but it's a big piece, right? Property of this size might have, 30, 40, $50 million in debt on the property with a mortgage in place. So if, it's very important before I close the transaction and my client takes title to it, that's released. So let's see here. Closing instruction letter is something you learn about a lot about when you first start out as a young attorney. NFR letter is an environmental component. Trying to get to some interesting stuff. Transfer tax stamps, that's something you deal with quite a bit as a young transactional attorney. The concept there is, the short version is the city of Chicago and a lot of different governmental entities around the country require you to pay a transfer tax when you transfer property from one party to another. So it might be, however many dollars per thousand of the value of the property. So it can be real money. Here we're going to be spending, $20,000, $30,000 in transfer taxes to the city for the right to transfer the property from one owner to another. And you obtain what they call transfer tax stamps to accomplish that.
Are most of your clients in the Chicago area, or I'd imagine they're all over the country?
Yeah, they're all over. This client is a client that I work with significantly, and they are based here, but they work all over the country. Mainly, like I said, mainly in the industrial space. And then as a firm and as a group in Chicago, we have clients all over the country. It's a good question. Some folks and some practice types focus mainly on one locale. If you're in property tax appeals, which is an aspect of real estate law, which I know you're familiar with from your past, that's obviously going to be very local. But transactions, it's another part of real estate transactions that I really enjoy is I can really do a transaction, and I'm doing a transaction very similar to this one in LA right now. So I can really do these transactions pretty much anywhere.
Is there a lot of difference from locality to locality?
There is, mainly in stuff that I don't have to get too in the weeds on, to be honest. It's a big part of it focuses on the approvals period that I talked about, working with whatever local government agencies oversee development in that area. That's something that generally clients will handle, or we have a group, a land use group at my firm that does exceptional work, and they're very familiar with how the process works in Chicago. So it's another group that, another practice area that's pretty area specific, but they can do work in other areas. And a lot of times that's an instance where we have an office in LA. So LA is a bad example, but if I were doing a project in Seattle, and my land use group wasn't comfortable with the approvals process in Seattle, we may actually reach out to another law firm that has a presence in Seattle with a land use group that's well respected and ask them to, take a piece of the project from us. So let's see here. As young transaction attorneys, another thing that you're going to be spending a large chunk of your time on, if any of you end up in that career, is title commitment, reviewing title and survey. I'm a fourth year or fifth year. I think I'm a fourth year, and I still do a fair amount of it. It's tedious and time consuming, but I will say it is where you learn all about real estate. You learn all these different things that are attached to property and the things you can do with the property and things you can and the way you solve those problems. So let's see here. Bunch of diligence items here. Organizational charts, that's a whole nother component of this. a large part of my job is actually more focused on what would be considered corporate law, corporate legal work, forming entities, drafting operating agreements, JV agreements. My firm also has a great corporate group, so a lot of times they'll be drafting the more complicated stuff. But myself and others in the real estate group certainly have to be familiar with operating agreements and how they function, resolutions, articles, all that is certainly a big part of our jobs. Development services agreement is essentially, is essentially an agreement where one party is going to be not only buying the property, but there may, in many instances, be a separate entity developing the property for a fee, which is essentially managing the process. Construction company, architects, engineers, this is all stuff we sometimes draft and always negotiate these agreements. Trying to skip down. Yeah, so that's the big stuff. Yeah, that's the big stuff that I wanted to go through on the checklist and the timeline. Does anybody have any questions about that?
Looks like Mary Emmy has one.
Yes, hi. I just have a general question. What would be your advice for first-time home buyers? What are the things they actually have to take into consideration before they decide to buy the home, or even before they sign anything?
It's a good question, and I wish I had a good answer. But I really function exclusively in the commercial space. And so I'm actually looking to buy my first home right now. And I wish I knew those answers because I don't know myself. But
what's your advice for then, like a first-time developer? I'm sure you've dealt with one in the past at least.
Yeah, no, and it's to answer the home buying question too. A lot of it is transferable, right? To be honest, I will probably still engage an attorney who focuses on residential acquisitions when I buy my home, even though I do commercial acquisitions myself for a living, because I do think it's different enough. But a lot of the stuff is still there. When you're trying to buy a home, you're going to review title to see what documents are recorded against the property you want to buy, because if there's, like I said, with the commercial property, if there's a mortgage or something attached to your property, you want that gone before you take title. So a lot of the things are the same. Finding financing is probably one of the big ones that would be present in both. But yeah, I mean, the one thing I would say that you don't have a lot of exposure to as a real estate attorney, that maybe I didn't fully understand before I started, is I have no concept of how to value property, which I know, Jack, is something you have a pretty deep understanding of from your experience, but it's not something I have a lot of exposure to. When projects come my way, they're usually pretty well baked, meaning my clients call me and say, we're buying this property for this price. We'll decide if it's economically viable. You draft all the documents, do all the diligence, make sure we're protected from any risks. But as far as figuring out, this project, like I said, I've been working on for a year, and I couldn't tell you if it's an economically good decision for my client at this point or not. So that's something that my position doesn't have a lot of exposure to.
Would it ever be appropriate for an attorney to come in and be like, no, this probably isn't good? Or do they even ask? It doesn't sound like they do.
They don't ask me. I don't know if there are attorneys they do ask. I'm sure there are. I think it differs. There are clients who sort of lean on us more heavily. Generally smaller clients. This client is a big client who has a whole team of a whole valuation team that makes those decisions. But I think it depends on the client relationship. I think there are certainly relationships out there at other firms, and maybe even within my practice group, some of our relationships where our clients may look to their attorney contacts for, more in-depth, is this a good decision? Is this something I should be doing? I will say we do get calls sometimes from our clients, even similar to this one, where they have big teams of folks looking at these issues and these risks. We still get calls from them every once in a while saying, there's this environmental contamination issue. Is this, I know you've run the traps on it, but one word answer, yes or no, is this something that we need to run away from? So you do field calls like that sometimes, and those are, interesting opportunities to be a bigger part of the decision-making process. So Jack, I know we had talked about maybe going through some of the things that you and I talked about over coffee a while back. What's our time cutoff?
We have about 20 minutes. So
Okay.
Up to 20 minutes is that answer. I actually did have a few questions from folks who couldn't be here today. And obviously still want to get their questions answered. So like some simpler ones are how to get started as an associate. And I noticed more recently you became counsel, not just an associate. So what's that transition look like, if anything at all? And the kind of tips for rising through a larger law firm.
Yeah, those are great questions. So I did just I transitioned to the role of counsel at the beginning of this year. It's essentially a intermediary position or title that some attorneys have between associate and partner, hopefully. And it can be for varying reasons. In my instance, it was because I've stepped into a large part of the client relationship with a large firm client. And so that is just a distinction to sort of give a little more credence for the client to working with me. What was I going to say? Lost my train of thought here. I think the big thing when you're starting out as an associate, the thing that I tell new associates at our firm, we had an associate who just started right now virtually, which is, not ideal and certainly a little more complicated than normal. But starting out, any new job is always stressful. Starting out as an attorney, I think, is incredibly stressful. I think you don't know what you don't know when you start out as a new attorney. Law school, I think, is more focused on training litigators. And I went to Loyola, and I loved Loyola. It's a phenomenal law school. And I know Kent is a great law school as well. Kent may be different, but most, broadly, I think at most law schools, I think a lot of folks would agree that law schools train you in a practical sense more for litigation. They tell you where to stand in the courtroom. They tell you, what you say to the judge. They don't tell you necessarily how to draft a checklist for a real estate transaction. A lot of the practical stuff you just learn as you go. And so, I tell folks when they're first starting out as new associates, you don't know much. I know immensely more about how to practice law as a transactional real estate attorney today than I did 4 years ago coming out of law school. I'm sure you guys have heard all the sayings about what you learn in law school, but you learn the language, you learn the ground rules, but I had no clue how to draft a purchase and sale agreement. I had no clue how to review title work, how to read a survey, how to follow a legal description and trace around a property on a survey. I mean, that's all stuff that I at least learned on the job. So that would be my biggest, that'd be my answer as far as advice about starting out. Know coming in that you're not going to know everything. And it doesn't mean you're stupid. It doesn't mean you don't deserve to be where you are. It just means that you have to learn it, which takes some time and work and billable hours, which is what you want as a young attorney. So,
is there anything that students can do before they start on the job to maybe get sort of a head start? Obviously, you're not going to become an expert, but are there things you can do to kind of get more familiar with that language, with the process and all the fine details?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think I don't know that I really did any of this, but I think there are. I think, if you know that you want a role such as mine, a transactional real estate role, whether it be at a big firm or a small firm or with a developer as some sort of in-house role, there are things you can do to expose yourself to the types of things that I'm talking about. You can find sources online for, Alta surveys. Alta provides guidebooks of title exceptions, of rules on surveys. I imagine you can find examples of surveys. Looking at stuff like that just to get a feel for what a title policy looks like, what a survey looks like, what a plat looks like. Get a sense of the notations that are made on those and what they mean. That stuff I think can save you some of the uncertainty you have starting out.
And that's Alta, ALTA, for if anyone's trying to look that up.
Right.
But Danny, what brought you to Chicago? I know, I think you're originally from Texas, if I'm not mistaken. So.
St. Louis, actually, but
that's right, St. Louis.
But your memory's not wrong. I spent a lot of time in Texas. My wife is from Texas. So I grew up in St. Louis. I spent most of my life in St. Louis until adulthood, all of my life until adulthood, and then went to undergrad in Texas. My wife went to grad school in Texas, and I moved to DC for a little while, worked on Capitol Hill, and realized that it was going to be hard to make a good living as a Capitol Hill aide. So that's what I went back to St. Louis, worked on a campaign, and then had the same light bulb about campaign work. I loved working on a campaign, but not something that was going to be incredibly lucrative for my family unless you're doing it wrong. So that was when I made the decision to go to law school. And so I applied to law schools in Texas and DC, St. Louis, and Chicago, all the places where I had either spent time or had connections. And so I got into a couple law schools in each of those cities, came up to Chicago to look at Loyola, and made the decision to come up here. And then my firm, so I got my foot in the door at my firm through a summer associate position as a 1L at the end of my 1L year. And my firm is actually based in St. Louis. So I found that opportunity from contacts I had made in St. Louis and family, friends, and things like that from coming from where my firm was based. But I, was lucky in the sense that my firm has a Chicago office. So I was able to stay here in Chicago and have no plans on leaving anytime soon.
And then you mentioned that you really liked the process of real estate. Did you know as soon as you went to law school that you wanted to be a real estate attorney, or was it kind of during that process that you discovered that you liked real estate?
It's funny. That's a great question. And you and I talked about this before. I graduated undergrad in 2010. And so I took a few years off before law school. I worked on the Hill, went back to St. Louis and worked on a campaign. I spent 3 years doing other stuff after undergrad before law school. And so I have some friends who are my age who went straight through, who graduated law school in 08, 09. They'd be a little bit older than me, but not much. And that was obviously a time during the recession when folks weren't finding jobs. Even if you were number one in your class at a phenomenal law school, you might be having a hard time finding a job. A lot of friends were deferred for 6 months or 9 months, so they knew they had their positions. They knew they were going to be starting at their firm, but they weren't going to be starting in the fall like they thought. They were going to be starting the following summer. Obviously, that's probably concerns that you all have right now. It's a complicated time for the economy again right now. So good news, all those friends wound up on their feet. They're all in great positions that they love and doing great work. And you all might go through some additional hiccups and hurdles like they did in that graduating class, but you'll land on your feet if you just persevere and hang in there and keep working at it. So, but to answer your question, because I had seen them go through that process of uncertainty, of finishing law school, having student loans, and not necessarily having a solid job that used their legal degree, I decided to wait until I knew exactly what I wanted to do before I went to law school. So I knew I wanted real estate law. I actually knew, if you can believe it, that I wanted to be a Thompson Coburn because it's the largest firm based in St. Louis, where I'm from. So I was very familiar with the firm, and it was my goal. And I just I worked hard in law school, but I got very lucky to wind up in the practice area that I wanted and the law firm that I wanted. But yeah, what attracted me to real estate before law school was the idea that I can see a project from beginning to end. I really like that aspect of it. But also the ability to, a lot of my work is outside of Chicago, but probably 25-30% of my work is in Chicago. This project that I showed you all the timeline and checklist for is in Chicago. My family, my wife and my two kids, pre-COVID, used to eat at a restaurant right next door to it. And it was cool. Before COVID, I could sit down with my daughter and say, look, I'm working on that building right there. That's where there's going to be this other building, and daddy's drafting all the documents for it. So it's a fun thing to be able to see what you're working on in the real world.
Well, I mean, you said you're lucky, but luck's where preparation meets opportunity, or however the quote goes. So you certainly prepared yourself, because you said you had been networking in St. Louis, especially when obviously you live there. What sorts of, obviously that landscape's a little awkward right now. So what sorts of tips do you have for building a network during the COVID era? What's kind of the best route of action for students now?
Jack, are you a 3L?
I am.
Okay, I thought so. If anyone on is a 1L or a 2L, I would say just ask yourself, what would Jack do? Because I really do think that you're doing all the things that I think helped me, and way more. Stuff like this webinar, thinking outside the box and connecting with folks who are already practicing and establishing those relationships. It's invaluable. So. But pre-COVID, I would have said, do what Jack and I both focused a lot of our time on before law school and during law school, which is just asking people to go get coffee with you. It's how Jack met me, I believe, right?
Yep.
Jack reached out to me and we got coffee, and, I did a ton of that before law school. Before law school, it was meeting with attorneys and saying, do you like being an attorney? And I got a lot of no's. But I did it anyway, and I'm glad I did it. But during law school, it was meeting with folks and saying, how do you like your firm? What's your practice like? And it was literally doing what Jack did to me, just emailing someone and saying, hey, we went to the same law school, or we're interested in the same practice, and I'm a 2L or I'm a 3L at whatever law school. Would you be willing to get coffee? Can I buy you a coffee? Can we get on a 10-minute phone call? Establishing those connections. Number one, you establish those connections with folks. Jack and I have spoken a number of times now, and whether it's 6 months from now or 10 years from now, if Jack and I's paths cross, I'm gonna know Jack. If Jack's ever applying to Thompson Coburn, or if whatever it is, I'm gonna want to help Jack because we have this relationship now. Establishing those connections and those relationships is invaluable. So COVID and the COVID area, I think, I don't envy you guys. It's certainly more complicated than normal. I spoke to a law student, another student from a different law school who had done a similar thing, who had reached out to me last year, and we had coffee together, and he followed up with me recently, and I forget what law school he was at, but he said that his school, he he was about to begin the OCI process, and his law school was no longer, because of the disruption as a result of COVID, his law school was no longer going to release rankings. And so, you know, he asked me what I thought about that. And I said, you know, again, just like I'll tell you all, I think you're all going to be fine. If you're working hard, you're smart, you're good people, you're going to find good positions. You're just going to it might be a little harder than it was for me and folks who graduated before all of this. But I did tell him, you know, I think without a law school ranking, just using Thompson Coburn as an example, we would love to interview every law student in Illinois and the surrounding states when we're trying to pick our people, but we can't. So, you know, a lot of folks don't like it, but the practical way to weed down who you are going to interview is a ranking process. And so we rely on that from law schools pretty heavily. We certainly do our best to look beyond that, to look beyond just strictly grades and rank. But I told him, I said, you know, I think without that, the thing that is going to be the differentiating factor is what steps have you done? What work have you put in to make connections in the industry that you want to get into? So if you want to be at a law firm, how many attorneys at law firms have you met with? How many folks would recognize your name if you emailed them your attorney or your resume? You know, that stuff I think is always invaluable. I think it was very helpful for me to do these, you know, sort of coffee meeting and, you know, informal meetings. But I think during the COVID era, it's going to be harder to do, unfortunately, and more important. So I don't know what a good answer is. I think stuff like this, thinking outside of the box and finding other ways to connect with folks is huge. Everyone likes to try to pass on advice, right? It feels good for me as a fourth-year attorney to be able to tell law students, like, these are the things I did. Hopefully they work for you. Hopefully they're helpful for you. I think most people are receptive when you make a request like that. So if you know, have the opportunity and you have the gumption, you have to be a little brave in reaching out to people you don't know and asking them to take some time out of their day to talk to you. But if you do it, I think it's worthwhile. And I think it's probably more important now than ever. Because like I said, if you, just as the example of not having rankings, you know, it's hard for law firms to differentiate between, you know, 100 law students at each law school, other than who they know, who they've met, who they know is a good person, who's working hard, who's trying to make those connections. So.
Well, thank you for your kind words and your words of wisdom as well. Any other questions for Daniel? I've gone through all the questions that everyone else sent in, and it seems like this is a good spot to wrap up if there are no further questions. I'll take the silence as there being no further questions. But thank you very much, Daniel, for taking the time out of your day to come speak with us. More people outside of this group will see it as well when we send it out to the rest of the group, for those who had to go to class, unfortunately, but they'll definitely still be able to get some value out of this, which is great.
Great. Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Jack, and thanks for everyone for joining. I'll just add really quick before we sign off. If any of you ever want to talk the way Jack and I did initially, or you have questions about resume, about OCI, about firms, about the practice, absolutely anything, I'm happy to talk. So never hesitate to reach out to me by email. Jack has all my contact information, and I'm always happy to talk. So
yeah, and I should also ask, is that all right if I share that with the rest of the club as well, your email address?
Yeah, absolutely. Please do.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Daniel. Until next time, and see you all for our next webinar in a couple weeks, everyone.
Sounds great. And I'm seeing the messages come in. Look forward to speaking with all of you. Thanks again.